Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the third and final session of Carbon is Key. My name is Brian McLean and I'm the Director of Communications and Sustainability at AGS Airports, which owns Aberdeen, Glasgow and Southampton airports. And I'm joining you from my office in Glasgow, which is the host airport for COP26. Just a few miles away, delegates from across the world are locked in negotiations to agree, hopefully, a global response to what is a truly global challenge, climate change. This afternoon's session is an opportunity to hear from some of the leading players in aviation on how our sector can and is playing its part in securing a future that's inclusive, low carbon and connected. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to our speakers. So this afternoon, we're joined by Michael Rossell, Senior Vice President, International Relations and Corporate Secretary, ACI World. Gonzalo Velasco, Business Plan and Innovation Director, Ferrovial Airports.
Hello.
Hi, Gonzalo. Scott Cary, Ports and Airports Project Manager, National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Sergio Fernandez, Director Airport Passenger Cargo Security Europe, IATA. And Holly Greig, Deputy Director for Aviation Climate Change at the DFT. Welcome, everybody. Now, before we start, I just want to remind you all that you can put questions or comments to any of the speakers at any time via the chat area, which you will see on your right, and we'll try to respond to each and every one. Delegates can also communicate in private or public to groups of up to 6 people using the front row networking tool, which again you'll hopefully see on the bottom right of your screen. So now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Michael Rossell, the Senior Vice President for International Relations and Corporate Secretary of ACI World. Michael is responsible for relations with ICAO and other international organisations across the full spectrum of civil aviation policy, including safety, security and environmental protection. Before joining ACI World, Michael was the United Kingdom Permanent Representative on the ICAO Council, and he has extensive experience of international civil aviation regulation and policy making, in particular where these regulations and policies have a direct impact on the safe, secure and sustainable development of international civil air transport. Welcome, Michael, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon everyone in the UK, good morning from sunny Montreal, and good evening to anybody who is joining us from the Far East. We live in interesting times, as I say, and the presentation that I'm going to give today is about what ACI has been doing, focusing particularly on a long-term carbon goal. But before I start, there's a couple of introductory remarks that I'd like to make. The first is that it's important to recognize, as everyone does, I think, that airports are always someplace, and they are a feature which is governed by, amongst other things, their geography, the community around them, the communities that they serve, and the economic circumstances in which they find themselves. The context of this study is that we are a member organization. We have a very active World Governing Board, which is representative of airports around the world. And it is this board that decided that it needed to look further into what airports needed to do in order to deliver tangible results with respect to a long-term carbon goal. And I should say that the outcome of the study was by no means a foregone conclusion. However, in the context of the study, which was done for us by ICF and Airbiz, there was nothing that was truly surprising, but the thing that was of great comfort in the fact was that there were no surprises. There is a general willingness and readiness from the airport community to take action, and the study helps us, and I will come to that at the end, in looking at the ways that that action can be taken and the time frame for doing it. So let me move then to the next slide, please. And this is the spoiler alert. Indeed, it is the spoiler itself. This is the result of the study. This is what we were able to conclude as a result of the outcomes from the study. And that is that ACI member airports are committed to achieving a net zero goal. But of course, it means that they can't do it alone. They need to work with other stakeholders, and particularly with governments, to make sure that the outcomes are deliverable. So the next slide, please. Let me just quickly run through some of the key aspects. What is it? It is a global, aspirational, and voluntary goal. And given what I was saying about each airport being in particular circumstances, we need to bear this in mind as we go through the presentation. So the global goal aligns with the IPCC goal of limiting global warming to less than 1.5 degrees centigrade. It is a global goal, and it covers the nearly 2,000 member airports. It's an aspirational and voluntary goal. It focuses on emissions directly from the airports, under the control of airports, so scope 1 and 2 emissions only. It is looking at absolute reductions, that we're not talking about offsetting here, but we are looking at other methods of reducing CO2 emissions. And we recognize that we are looking at a moving target, and therefore we need to review the progress every 5 years so that we can best help the airports achieve it. So next slide, please. So as I say, different airports, different circumstances, different journeys. And we recognize that not all airports are in the same place. They're not going to be able to move at the same speed. And we have some airports which have already reached net zero. There are others where it is going to take some time longer. And this comes back to the point I made about being in different places with a different journey. So let's have a look at the next slide, and we'll talk now about the approach that we took to the study. The first thing to do was to establish the baseline. We had data for 2010, and we were able to update that with 2019 data. And we wanted to make sure that we had got a firm baseline from which we were able to work to look at where carbon was expected to go in the future. We engaged with all stakeholders, and we went from the CEOs of airports around the world. We wanted to make sure that there was nobody left out of this conversation. We wanted to make sure that the study represented the airport community as a whole. We then looked at the emission reduction pathways. So this is not a we will be net zero by 2050. We were looking at the ways of getting there so that the outcome of the study was credible. It wasn't just something that was aspirational. It was something where we had got a very clear plan for how we were going to be able to achieve the agreed outcome. So next slide, please. So we build on a strong baseline, and answering the first question in the poll is that the emissions from airports were 18.6 million tons of CO2 from scope 1 and scope 2 emissions in 2010. And by 2019, this had decreased marginally to 18.4 million tons CO2. This is an indication that airports were already decoupling from growth. The number of passengers handled by ACI airports increased from under 5 to over 8 billion passengers in that period. Our forecasting work showed that if there was no further decarbonisation between now and 2050, then airports would more than double by that date. So what we have done is that we've taken that as the no action, that's the black line that you see, but we do make an assumption of a continuation of electricity grid decarbonisation, which is the purple line, which gives us a revised baseline of 24.9 million tons. So that's the gap that we see between now and 2050 if we are to achieve net zero. So let's move on to the next slide. And to give you a little bit more information about how we worked together to make sure that we had got this engagement as the study was completed. So the first element is that we had very active participation. This was something that was supported, as I said, by the board, by the CEOs from our members, but also at grassroots level. So we were able to conduct interviews, we carried out regional workshops, and we had an online survey where we were able to poll the full membership. So this is a truly global study, which gives us a very high degree of confidence in the outcomes. We also, of course, took account of the impact of COVID-19. However, and this I think is a gratifying point, is that whilst there were short-term reductions in traffic, short-term reductions in emissions, we get a feeling that from the members that they expect growth to return. With that, of course, emissions will increase again, but there is no lack of will in order to take action to address these questions. So climate change and sustainability more generally were cited as being of increasing importance by the membership, and a general sense that they needed to be prepared for what comes next. So next slide, please. And that is one that I referred to at the beginning, is that geography matters, and the different circumstances of different airports has an impact on their ability and indeed their political will to take action. So as well as the geographic location, which can have an impact on elements such as heating and cooling required, the availability of electricity, the type of electricity, whether or not it's decarbonized. I live in Montreal here in Quebec, where most of our electricity is from hydro and is therefore already decarbonized. Other parts of the world are still heavily reliant on coal-fired electricity, coal-produced electricity, and therefore their route to decarbonization is going to be slower and take longer. So I think that it's important that, as we develop our plan, then we do need to take account of these regional differences and these different political realities. Next slide, please. So here we have an animated roadmap, and I don't know if you can start that. This is perhaps not the most important, because we've seen this graph already, but it does illustrate quite well how we will take the path to decarbonization. I think in the interest of time, I'll actually skip this and move on to the next slide and talk about some of the steps we are taking in terms of practical technology mapping and forecasts. And I recognize that there's a lot of detail in this slide and indeed in the presentation generally. And I'm very, very happy for these slides to be circulated after the production. So Just to look very briefly at the components and tools that airports can use. There is the classic scope 1, and this is the on-site. Heat, of course, is a massive consumer of power, particularly when we're talking about gas or coal-fired. And the way that airports are able to address these scope 1 emissions will again depend on their circumstances, but has a big potential for reducing the net amount of CO2 that they are producing. They can also look at their vehicle fleet. They can look at the power which is provided to aircraft, and we can then move towards the scope 2 emissions and effectively the decarbonization of the grid. And airports already can choose to purchase green electricity, depending again on location and circumstances. There are other elements where they can look for efficiency measures, and here we can look specifically at LEDs, efficient heating and ventilation, air conditioning, and building design is critical in terms of future emissions reductions. And then finally, we look at this question about negative emissions technology, and where airports are not able to make the emissions reductions themselves, then they can certainly be looking at this technology as a way of reducing the total emissions in order to get to net zero. So the last substantive slide that I have is with respect to what are we doing with our members, and what are we doing to support those. So next slide, please. And here we are helping our members, we're supporting them in terms of developing their own framework for action. We are providing support in terms of identifying gaps and the capacity building requirements that they need. We are collecting best practice, which can then be shared with members so that we can learn and they can learn from each other. We're looking at how we can facilitate their access to finance, and particularly green finance. That in itself is a subject which needs further discussion. We are helping airports take the necessary action. We are using the action that they have been taking as part of our advocacy to support our members as they have these discussions with governments. And you will recall the early slide where we say that this objective requires engagement with governments. And then we're providing opportunities for the airport industry to get together so that it can reassess and adapt as required by the interim milestones in terms of the review that we will do in 5 years' time. So this discussion that we are having today is an absolutely essential part of how we need to be moving forward. We need to be collaborating with all stakeholders. And I think that I'm extremely grateful to have been invited into this session, because I think it helps the general community, the broader community, understand what ACI World has done, what we are doing with our members around the world, and the continued engagement that will be absolutely essential if we're going to make this a success and that we're going to reach our net zero goal. Thank you, everybody, and thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Michael. That's great, and a great start to the session. And it's quite clear that ACI is doing an awful lot to support its members. I think what I picked up on, you touched on, the ambition of airports, the need, I think, importantly, for partnerships as well. Nobody can do this on their own. And the fact that the industry has made huge progress, you talked about how we decoupled the growth in passenger numbers from the growth in emissions. And I don't think that's something that's fully appreciated out with the sector. And perhaps if we look at the results of the poll, I think the majority of respondents, 50%, in response to the poll question about emissions by airports, opted for between 20 and 40 million tonnes. So I think perhaps from a comms point of view, we've got a bit more work to do to articulate the steps we've taken. If I could just say, you finished about how we need to move forward. I mean, what do you think the next steps to the next course of action airports should be implementing?
So that's absolutely the right question. We have shown through the study that it is feasible on a global scale, but because we as a community are made up of individual members, each of those members need to be able to see how they can do it themselves. The circumstances for each airport are different. I said that. And therefore, the rate of decarbonisation is going to be different. But the important thing is that they develop a plan. It won't just happen magically by itself. So what we're going to be doing at ACI is we're going to be collecting information from our airport members. We're going to be helping them develop their decarbonisation plans. And we're going to be able to use these elements of best practice to provide advice to members as to what can they do at an individual and local level to achieve these objectives themselves. As I said, this is a voluntary program, but I believe that by working together, we are going to be able to achieve that objective. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. I have to say, the ACI sustainability strategy for airports is an excellent document, and it's something that we at AGS referred to in developing our own sustainability strategy, which we launched earlier this year. Clearly, the focus for airports needs to be on how we get on top of our scopes 1 and 2 emissions, but how much of the strategy should focus on supporting our airport partners, when it comes to scope 3 emissions?
Again, absolutely the right question to ask. And there are things that we can do, particularly with respect to operations. One of the issues that we have been very actively pursuing with the air navigation service providers and with the airlines is this question about airport collaborative decision making. This means that we are able to use our limited infrastructure most effectively. And as we move from ACDM to total airport management, and we promote the development of the airport operation centers, the APOCs, then it means that there is going to be less time wasted on the ground, maneuvering, waiting, and getting people moving, getting people into the air, which is clearly to the benefit of the passengers as well as to the airlines, but also making much better use of existing infrastructure, reducing then requirements for new infrastructure, but making sure that as we develop that new infrastructure, then it also fits in to this new, more efficient operating environment, which will help bring down CO2 emissions. So generally speaking, it is a matter of collaboration on the ground, in the air, and with the surrounding communities as well. So I think with that, this is a matter that we're all in this together, and the panel that you've got together today, I think will shed more light on many of these issues. So thank you again for inviting me to speak. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you, Michael. It's been our pleasure. That was great, and as I say, a great way to start this session. And with that, we'll move on to our second speaker of the afternoon. Gonzalo Velasco leads the development of business plans for Ferrovial airports, integrating current and future innovation initiatives. Gonzalo is also a member of the AGS board and chair of the AGS Health, Safety, Security and Sustainability Committee, and chair of the ACI World Non-Aeronautical Activities Subcommittee. Gonzalo has worked in several airports around the world, developing long-term business plans. And as I say, I'm pleased that he's a member of our own board here at AGS. Gonzalo, welcome.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks for the opportunity. If you don't hear me or if you cannot see the presentation that I'm showing, please let me know. Okay. Then I'll start.
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, perfect. So what I want to share with you today is framed into these 3 elements. So addressing climate change, then the approach that the company that I work for, Ferrovial, has on this matter, and then the next area of focus for us. So let's start, and perhaps this is a little bit of overlap and duplication to what you'd heard before, but I think it's important to establish the right basis for the discussion. So what we're aiming here is to slow down climate change, and this was an objective that it was set up actually at a COP event, COP21, so just 6 years ago from today. So at that time, it was decided that reducing CO2 emissions was the main tool that we could use in order to limit the increase of temperature for the world. And obviously, you've already seen this chart. A lot of stats were produced at that time, and then a lot of methodologies and tools were developed in order to assess how each sector, how each industry could reduce CO2 and achieve those targets for limiting that temperature increase. So let's get into a little bit more detail. And this is a scheme that I produced myself just to try to communicate in a very clear way what are the different stages and not to misinterpret the different terminology, because in a lot of cases you will find that people use carbon neutral or net zero indistinctively, and they are not the same. They are not really the same. So one is carbon neutral, which is what we used to speak in the past, so reduce emissions, but offsetting with credits. Net zero is there is no offset. You will need to have to remove the residual CO2, but there is a subtlety here on the first characteristic, which is reduce CO2 to the maximum. So what does this mean? There is a little bit of ambiguity here, and it's in every sector it's different, and I think this is an ever-changing definition. Hopefully it will be more clear in the future, because as of today, different organizations tend to interpret different things. And the reality is that everyone has different thresholds for assessing what is feasible, what is not feasible. If it's economically feasible, then what is your threshold in terms of that profitability or financeability? So a lot of discussion to be held there in order to really have a consistent approach for a net zero definition. And then we have zero carbon, which is basically no emissions. So let's look then at the different, before looking at the different sectors, also bear in mind that the Paris Agreement that is going to be committed to through the aviation sector or from the aviation sector is on the net zero. Just to be clear, it's net zero, not zero carbon. So looking at the different segments, starting with airlines. For airlines, most of the airlines target to be carbon neutral by 2020s. And then net zero, most of them target 2050s. And then if we move to zero carbon, then we will get into more detail later on. But the reality is that for the foreseeable future, that will only be for a segment of the market. And then airports. So for airports, most airports are carbon neutral. And then for net zero, most of them are targeting also 2030. And ACA has expressed as an association the target of 2050. And then if we move to zero carbon, we believe that for an airport, for scopes 1 and 2, so what is the direct responsibility of the airport, that is achievable. And I'm sure that we will start seeing that in the near future. So yes, a reminder that although aviation contributes only to 2% of the CO2 emissions of the world, airports within the aviation is only 10% of that. So let's get into a little bit more detail on how aircraft could evolve into this net zero target. And I like this table coming from ATAC report, which is very clear and basically states how over time technology will evolve. And aside from sustainable aviation fuels, there will also be electric, hydrogen, other technologies that could get to that net zero or zero carbon, but that will take time. And then if we move horizontally and we look at the segments that contribute more to CO2 emissions, which are basically medium haul, long haul, then what we see is that sustainable aviation fuels is basically the solution for the foreseeable future, for the 2050 target that we have now. And if we look at how different countries are addressing how to get to the gap that I think everyone in the sector knows that we have with sustainable aviation fuels, which is the cost. And normally we see that there is a multiplier of 4 or 5 times the cost of sustainable aviation fuel compared to the traditional fuel for aviation. In the EU, what seems to be the path is that there is going to be an imposition on what is the percentage that needs to be used. So basically, that automatically will increase the cost of the airlines and potentially flight ticket prices. Whereas in the US, the approach is totally different, which is basically, well, I will encourage you to use a sustainable aviation fuel, and I will give you, and by doing it, I will give you tax credits. So basically, from a financial perspective, from a P&L perspective of an airline, it could be neutral or it will help to make it financially neutral. So you will see very different approaches, potentially very different outcomes, up to you to decide what could be better. And you're also very familiar with this chart, and this relates specifically to airports and how can airports get to net zero or zero carbon. And just a reminder that the main levers for that is to decarbonize thermal energy, to move all the fleet vehicles to electric, obviously to use renewable energy, whereas it could be generated on site or it could be acquired from the grid. And then obviously there could be ways in order to capture that CO2 in a natural way or in an artificial way. And then here we also see, according to other forecasts in which they assess the different weights that the different technologies and measures will take, here is very relevant to see from this study from the Royal Netherlands Aerospace Center and SEO Amsterdam Economics, that they include here this improved ATM and operations, which actually was mentioned also in the presentation before, that if we manage air traffic in a better way, that could have a substantial positive impact in many ways. Obviously, it's because it reduces waiting times for everyone, but it reduces CO2. That is very critical, and obviously it will reduce travel cost. And because we are seeing that a lot of things are basically pushing costs higher, if we invest in air traffic management, then that will be a really good lever. And this is a call for public authorities. This is a call for states, because most of the air traffic management, at least in Europe, in the US, is managed by the states. So this is an important call for them, because they really can have an impact in this for the benefit of the whole aviation industry. So we're talking about environment, CO2, that is pure environment, but what about sustainability? Because a lot of times we talk about CO2 as that is just the way to achieve sustainability. But as far as I recall, and we can read in the literature, sustainability is also social and is also governance. In some cases, it's also economic. And for example, ACI always puts economic into this sustainability concept. For me, economic could be, but in some cases, for example, we are talking about organization that is non-for-profit, then perhaps the economic component is not that critical. And we know that there are airlines, there are certain air routes, there are certain airports that doesn't necessarily need to be economic from a sustainable perspective, but they are a basic economic engine for the region, and they are a social service. So, as I was referring to before, what we see is that we might be having higher fuel costs. We are also seeing in some countries that there potentially be higher aviation taxes. And also we are seeing that in some countries there could be even flying restrictions, like for example in France, in which they want to limit the domestic flights. So what does this fall into? Potentially, more than potentially, I think, by fact, lower passengers. So if we have lower passengers, then, and I'm not an economist, but I think that we can foresee that there will be lower offer supply, obviously. So there will need to be a readjustment, and there will be higher flight ticket prices. And just because the sector that we are in has an important lever, which are the economies of scale, which apply to all the value chain of the aviation sector. So we could start getting into this spiral of lower passengers, then higher flight ticket prices, then we have lower passengers, and that will be great from an environmental perspective because we will be reducing CO2. But is it good from a social perspective? And I think that there is a lack of deepness in the debate that we are having today in this regard, because I think we always talk about sustainability, but not really addressing all the elements of sustainability. And you might think that, well, that this is just not going to happen. This is the future. Well, actually, or it's a potential future. Actually, the future is here, and that is already happening. I mean, the reality is that we are having less passengers because of the COVID situation, and at the same time, all this environmental pressure is coming up into play. So the reality is that what we are seeing is that travel will become more expensive, and from a social perspective, that is, I think, hard to assume, because basically what you are preventing is people that used to be able to meet relatives that are far away won't be able to do it. Companies that could do businesses with other companies that are far away, they cannot do it. So the social and economic impacts could get also into a very negative spiral. Okay, let's move on then into what is the approach of Ferrovial towards sustainability. So our main principles are three, which are pretty obvious: reduce negative impacts, provide alternative solutions to the existing ones, and set targets. Because obviously, if you don't set targets, then it's very difficult to measure against. And for that purpose, here I've highlighted some selected initiatives that we have for environmental, social, and governance, always keeping in mind also those three pillars. And I will devote a little bit of time on net zero emissions, bird reports, and airport sustainability index. So starting with airport sustainability index. So this is a tool that we have created in order to assess what is the sustainability level of an airport. We do it for our own airports, we do it for the airports that we analyze. And basically, this tool covers everything, which as of today in the market, we don't see for airports a tool that could cover this in the broader sense. So this is an internal tool that we have developed and that we are already using. So moving on into vertiports, which for us is the next generation of air transport infrastructure. And basically, this is an infrastructure that will have zero carbon operation, not just because of this aircraft that will be electric, but also because the whole infrastructure could be zero carbon from inception. So airport infrastructure could be zero carbon. There will be seamless passenger journey because there will be a pre-seamless operation. Then the security will evolve into a non-intrusive security. This infrastructure will be integrated into the city and with other modes of transport, and it will be low noise, which also is an environmental concept that we've forgot about because of this CO2 trending topic. But the reality is that noise is an issue that we constantly need to address. And here you have a video that reflects the vision that we have for vertiports, which, as you can see, we can integrate green energy generation within the infrastructure. We can have electric charges as we have it for cars nowadays. We'll have them for aircraft. There will be quick turnarounds. And while the passengers get on board, this aircraft will be charged. There won't be long waiting times because effectively these vehicles will provide services that will be competing with other modes of transport, like taxis, like trains, like buses. They will be low noise. And the comparison with that is a vacuum cleaner. So 100 meters away, it will be 60 decibels, like a vacuum cleaner, basically. And they will be fully integrated into cities. Obviously, if there is a location that is available for that. So that is the concept that we want to develop. And we are at an early stage of this, but we hope that by 2025, this aircraft will be certified and that we could have infrastructure that will be able to provide service to these vehicles and passengers. So this is just another picture just to show the simplicity of the operation. And we know that with this, we are not going to solve the net zero or zero objective for the aviation sector, but it's a seed in order to get into a greater project in the long-term future. And finally, CO2 targets. So for our portfolio of airports, we have consolidated the targets that we have to reduce CO2 with a reduction of 25% by 2030 and by 80% by 2050, with the net zero objective by mid-2030s. So these are the overall targets that we have, and they are based on the science-based targets initiatives, which is a reference that we encourage every company to start using. And finally, next area of focus, which hopefully is not that bad, but we need to be conscious that the climate change is already having effects, and that these effects will have impacts that even we try to slow down with the CO2 reductions, they are going to be there. And our plan is to have infrastructure that is resilient, we have resilient operations, and we have financial resilience. So by addressing these three pillars, we believe that we can create infrastructure that could be there for the short, medium, and long term, and we'll be able to address all these challenges that we are facing. And thanks a lot. That was all that I had.
That's great, Gonzalo, and that's a lot. And I think just saying the video, the vertiports, the future really is here. And I think you touched on a number of points. I think the main two, suppose, there really is no silver bullet when it comes to decarbonising the aviation. You're right, it's going to take a range of technologies and interventions. And how do we grapple with the challenge of growing while shrinking? How do we grow our passenger numbers and our airports while shrinking the carbon footprint? And I think everyone will be bowled over by the concept in 2025 of getting in one of the eVTOLs you showed. We just have time for one question. I suppose I would just like to ask, do you think airports have a problem in accessing finance, perhaps because they're perceived as being the sort of non-green assets?
I would like to have another response to you, but the reality is that as of today, airports are starting to see that there is some reluctancy from investors, equity and debt investors, in order to access to large amounts of financing. And the good news about it is that there are ways in order to address this, and it's basically about education. We a lot of times, I don't think we properly explain how sustainable our operations are, and we need to explain that the investment that we undertake at our airports is a sustainable investment, and we need to explain that properly. And if we link our sustainability targets together with our investment commitments, then we should be able to have that access to financing that we need.
That's great, Gonzalo. And I think that perhaps came through in Michael's piece as well, the need to maybe communicate the huge progress we as an industry have and are making. But listen, thank you. We've run out of time, but I really appreciate that. It was a fantastic overview and a great insight into what's coming, perhaps not so far away. So Gonzalo, thank you. We'll now move on to our next speaker, who has more than 25 years of experience leading teams for port, airport, and Department of Defence infrastructure and facilities efforts worldwide. For the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, he aligns port and airport programs lab-wide, integrating the unique expertise of a Department of Energy national laboratory with both aviation and maritime needs. He's also a licensed professional engineer and LEED accredited professional. Please welcome Scott Cary. Oh. Hi, Scott, I think you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's you.
Thank you. Great. So yeah, thank you very much for that introduction. My name is Scott Cary. I work with the U.S. Department of Energy's National Renewable Energy Laboratory. We're based in the Western United States in Golden, Colorado. First, a real quick intro. So the National Renewable Energy Laboratory is one of 17 U.S. Department of Energy national laboratories that are intended to help bridge from, say, initial development of new technologies to adoption within industry, both within the United States and worldwide. We have roughly 3,000 staff currently, and we spend the majority of the time working both with industry and also on government initiatives related to renewable power, sustainable transportation, energy efficiency, and we call it energy systems integration, which is tying all those different efforts together as they come together between the electrical grid infrastructure to vehicles to the thermal requirements on airports. Now, we look at this as we are bridging that gap between where you hear about a great new concept coming out of the university. We're there when corporations can't afford to take that technology to the next level to where it can be used. An example would be some of the solar panels that you see that are being used on GPS satellites currently were developed initially in the university in the 80s and then expanded at NREL to the point that they could be utilized long term to provide energy for GPS satellites. It's just an example. And we have been working with the ground industry on electrification, hydrogen, others, and working with OEMs anywhere from BMW to Chrysler to others on their technologies on the ground. So just a quick snapshot, we're talking about the global transportation system, and we really appreciate all the great work and the discussions going on Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions and the work that ACI and others are doing related to this. That is an important part. First thing is reduce the amount of energy you need to use. But then as you move past that, then we start to get into the question of, okay, what can we do in the Scope 3 emissions? And that's really where we're spending our time. Now, if you look at it based on, we've heard roughly 9% of global emissions are attributed to aviation. If you look at it based on the per ton moved capacity, aviation is a much higher intensity than other modes of transportation, but it also has benefits, not just for moving cargo, but also for moving passengers. And so we have to balance those items. This looks very similar. This is the ATAG Waypoint 2050 report talking about where transitions are going. And you just saw this, and it's great that you did, because this is part of what we have seen as well in terms of where industry can go, and to help explain to put it out in terms of the technological readiness of different items and where efforts may be focused in terms of research and supporting analysis that can be used then for policymakers to make new decisions. And what you've seen is that sustainable aviation fuel is ready right now. It needs a scaling effort, but is moving forward. Right behind it, there's a lot of interest in electrification, both at the urban air mobility, the eVTOL side, but then also moving into the regional air mobility with fixed wing, shorter distances, and then moving on to hydrogen. We're going to cover those three today and just kind of run through those a little bit on where that is right now. And just for context, these are the people that we are currently working with. We prefer to work around the world on these topics, but right now the aviation side of NREL's efforts are primarily with U.S. agencies and a few international agencies. So sustainable aviation fuel, you heard about some of the discussions on policy related to potential incentives for SAF use in the United States. There's a strong U.S. focus on getting SAF deployed. I believe they're looking at 3 to 5 plants to be online with different methods for producing that SAF to be in place within the next 5 years. And you're seeing significant numbers of commitments related to blending sustainable aviation fuel into the system. It is intended to be a drop-in replacement, and there are multiple pathways to get into that, and it kind of ties into what you're seeing in terms of where ICAO is going in terms of their targets related to carbon-based SAF and then also e-fuels. A place that we've started to see more interest and are spending some time is electrified aviation. We have a system in the U.S. that subsidizes commercial aviation service into small communities. It's called the Essential Air Service Program. And it provides subsidies into communities that can benefit from the economic drive of being connected to larger communities. What you're seeing on the screen is an area out of Denver, Colorado, that is going to rural communities within roughly a 5-hour drive in the Western U.S., which is a significant distance to locations in communities that have economic reasons that they would like to stay connected into a large hub. These are communities of 15 to 20,000 people, and they will get anywhere from, right now they're getting between 5 and 10,000 enplanements per year, getting connected into these large hubs. They are subsidized for this effort and to the level of, I believe, for example, some of my family is from this area called Alamosa, Colorado, in the southern Colorado in the high Rockies. Alamosa is being subsidized to the level of $2.5 to $3 million a year for 6,000 enplanements, and that is because potentially because the carriers cannot afford to fly there. So we said, okay, assuming electrified aviation is coming in the 9 to 19 seat, we need to look at the system to say, where is the load and where is the ability to service this load? So we started this program by saying, first step, where are the distribution substations in these communities and are they available? Because of the size of the loads that are coming in, when you look at regional air mobility, you're looking at 3 to 10 typical electric vehicles is one aircraft. And if you try and follow the current model of turn times on aircraft, to fully recharge that aircraft requires massive amounts of energy. So we said, okay, where do we need to step back to the substation? And what was generally found was that there is a substation somewhat nearby in those communities, but that there potentially could be some impacts. The key thing that we figured out or started to see in the findings in this US program, we have very large subsidies to maintain the economic benefit of those communities. If you can transition from current available fuel cost for those operations running a Pilatus PC-12 to an equivalent electric aircraft, you're cutting your fuel costs potentially up to, it's a 10% of the current fuel costs. So we have a program that has high subsidies where a new technology can potentially reduce the operating costs, the emissions, and noise. And then the subsequent infrastructure that goes in those communities can improve the community resilience and reliability of their power supply and potentially build more industry in those communities. Now, where this comes into play, though, is as you start to get into your large hubs. We looked at 4 routes and the flights moving in and out of Denver, as an example. And based on their current flight schedules for those 4 aircraft, we assumed that you could have a potential load increase at Den, instantaneous load requests of up to 4 megawatts to charge 2 aircraft. Now let's scale that, and that is where we see there's opportunity to improve that system, and there are methods to take that on. I'll give you an idea. The current high power charging for vehicles is roughly 350 kW. Class 8 trucks are moving to the 1 megawatt level, and Charin and others are trying to move up to a 3.75 megawatt level. That's the charger. Now you have to get that energy to be able to be available to move very quickly into those vehicles, and it's going to stress the entire electrical system. And so there are technologies that are being worked on and can be deployed to take that on. One item to make sure to mention is that there currently are we are not aware of current standards, consistent standards between manufacturers on how they'd like to do their chargers. It's being worked on by multiple groups, including SAE and other manufacturers groups, but we have not heard that come into play. To give you an idea of the size of the load that is needed for one single commercial takeoff and landing regional air mobility charger, it's roughly a 700 to 800 kilowatt transformer, 480 volt 3-phase power. It's a small terminal size of transformer for, say, a non-primary airport. There are options that exist. You can do slow charging off-site. You can move some different items around. You can work on on-site energy storage. And as was just mentioned, is on-site generation. move where you make the energy closer to where you're using it, which reduces the infrastructure requirements. And these are some of the items you can begin to look at. You also can, there's also been a lot more interest recently on hydrogen related to aviation. US DOE is moving forward and trying to support this industry as well. And some of the manufacturers are going there as well, looking at how to repurpose hydrogen fuel cells from other sectors into aviation. You need to lightweight it. You need to come up with ways to store hydrogen in a way that's light but safe, and then work on your transfers of material. In addition, hydrogen is a key component of a lot of your synthetic fuels. And so making clean hydrogen at the front end is important to this program. You're seeing hydrogen fuel cells are moving up dramatically, and we're seeing more and more opportunities there. And when you think about this in terms of an airport system, an airport is essentially an energy node. And the amount of energy that currently moves for liquid fuels is dramatic and dwarfs any loads in a regional area. So you need to come up with ways to efficiently store that energy, understanding that the infrastructure is not available. Hydrogen could be part of that discussion in terms of stationary power. And there's been discussion from some of the large aircraft manufacturers about trying to work on getting a hydrogen infrastructure in place for efficient delivery through, say, pipelines. There's work on trying to repurpose existing pipelines that currently are steel can be sensitive to hydrogen and become brittle. So to repurpose existing pipelines to move hydrogen to airports, similar to how we move a lot of Jet A currently. So there's a lot of opportunity here, and the technologies exist. It's really linking all those technologies together. It is very clear, the Department of Energy has seen this, and we have seen this from OEMs as well as one of their laboratories, that there are opportunities here for hydrogen. And it moves into remote areas, it moves into areas that don't have infrastructure, but then also moves into your larger aircraft, because the power density of batteries does not really let you currently go past about 500 miles. One thing we want to make sure to mention is in September 2021, the Department of Energy announced they're calling it an Earthshot, which is they'd like to get to where it's $1 per kilogram of hydrogen in 1 decade. If you can get to that level of cost, it becomes much more economically viable for everyone to be able to use hydrogen in many more markets.
Sorry, Scott, just to say your sound's dropping in and out a bit there.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's the headset.
Okay. Let's move that down and see that's better. Okay. The Federal Aviation Administration is looking at near term. The Department of Energy is looking at a little bit more long term. They're both interested in these topics. The FAA is really trying to help the SAF industry move forward very efficiently. They've been doing that for years. And now the Department of Energy is trying to back that program by pushing for the supply chain for sustainable aviation fuel to be more active as well. What I just want to mention is we talk about these large loads potentially coming related to electrification on airports. You're going to be looking to try and move your thermal loads off of traditional fossil fuels onto electricity. You're going to be trying to move your vehicles onto electricity and trying to move potentially your aircraft. And then all your last mile deliveries that potentially are connected to your cargo are all clustered in these locations. There's also an opportunity the technology exists, and it appears to be starting to make sense, is to use hydrogen fuel cell electrolyzers as part of your system to manage energy storage, electricity storage on airports. And that's a growing area of interest and trying to blend those technologies into the airport. So who is working on solutions to assist industry? Now, this is a partial list. As I reviewed this, these are the people that we're working with. And I'm sure there are many more that are working on these systems around the world. And we look at an airport as essentially a small city. And there are so many different opportunities where all those systems come together, whether it's from efficiency and moving through the different sectors. We wanted to also give you just a start of some of the resources we have seen. We'd love to hear about other things going on. We talk to people wherever we can around the world to share ideas and to share resources to help this entire industry grow. Thank you so much.
That's great. Thanks, Scott. That's excellent. A great overview of, I suppose, what all airports have to now think about going forward. I suppose with AGS, we're a regional airport group, and we do have a number of long haul, but we've a real opportunity to be a test bed, I suppose, for hydrogen and electric. Given we service the Highlands and Islands communities in Scotland, the Channel Islands, so that was a really helpful one. We're running over slightly, so if I could just ask you one quick question: what do you see as the largest challenge for the sector in meeting 2050's target?
What we're seeing right now is probably the economics, is lining up the policy with the economics of those situations. These are viable technologies. It's making them economical where industry can move forward.
And with that, Scott, like I say, thanks very much again. That was a great insight into the work that you and your team are doing. We'll now move on to our next speaker. Sergio Fernandez is Director of Airports, Passenger, Cargo and Security for IATA Europe. He began his professional career as a consultant at KPMG, and after 11 years of working with multiple customers in numerous industries, he joined IATA in 2008. Sergio is now responsible for supporting IATA members and having secure and efficient operations for them, for their passengers, and for their cargo across European airports. A citizen of Spain, Sergio holds a computer engineering degree from the University Politécnica de Madrid. I cannot speak Spanish, so I will hand over to you, Sergio. And I would start here, we are running a little bit over, so we'll try and make back some time.
Thank you very much, Brian, and you have done pretty well your Spanish, so don't worry. So good afternoon all. It's my absolute pleasure to be with you here today. IATA is the trade association for the world's airlines, representing around 290 airlines, what means around 83% of total air traffic. We support many areas of aviation activity and help formulate industry policy on critical aviation issues. Of course, climate change is on top of the agenda. A month ago, the industry came together to agree on a new, more ambitious long-term climate goal for air transport. We committed to reaching net zero carbon emissions by 2050 globally. This builds on previous long-term goal who was set a decade ago. This is support of the Paris Agreement to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. The existing goal to net zero was not a decision that was taken lightly. Aviation is sometimes seen as a conservative industry, and that is good. There is a reason we are known as the safest mode of transport. And in that sense, we don't like to make big promises without the backup to know that we are able to achieve them. In that sense, decarbonization aviation is a huge challenge. 10 billion passenger journeys will take place in 2050. That means that the industry will need to abate 1.8 gigatons of carbon that year. Net zero can be achieved by aviation. It's going to be incredibly challenging, but it can be done. As some of the colleagues mentioned before, there is no silver bullet. Achieving net zero will likely involve a combination of different measures. Sustainable aviation fuel, new technology, especially related to the new aircraft and propulsion systems, operational and infrastructure improvements, and carbon capture and offsetting. We will need a transition away from fossil fuels by mid-century, mainly through the shift to sustainable aviation fuels. And the pie chart that you can show a potential scenario and how we think that we could achieve this net zero in 2050. 65% of the reductions will be obtained through SAF, 30% through new technologies, 3% operations and infrastructure, and 90% of carbon capture, which could also be used to create more SAF. Let's do a deeper dive into the key measures to achieve net zero, starting with SAF. The chart makes clear that there is a tremendous challenge to ramp up SAF production from around 100 million liters today to around 449 billion liters in 2050. However, it's important to note that this kind of increase is not unprecedented in other sectors. We have seen how this has changed and had an increase in wind power generation over the recent years. Based on current commitments by airlines and some target policy support already in place, we think that around 6.5% of our fuel supply could be SAF in 2030. Let's see what we could do to push that even higher. Important to mention that when we are talking about and pushing for SAF is always trying to or keeping secured biodiversity and not competing with food or water. Our net zero commitment is based on removing as much as possible emissions. However, we might have a situation in 2050, hopefully not, where some emissions may still need to be offset or removed from the atmosphere by other means. These charts show how rapidly the industry use of offsetting will diminish over the next 30 years, and the initial reliance fades as SAF come on a stream in large quantities. Another key area is the research, development, and deployment of both evolutionary as well as revolutionary technologies, including potentially electric and hydrogen flights. Turning to new aircraft technology, we have been very careful and suggested that this could contribute around 30% of the emissions reductions we'll need in 2050. The key technologies will be electric hybrid, and hydrogen aircraft. This will start to be available in 2030 and 2040. Long-term are exciting technologies, but it's important to stress that the industry is not reliant on this to meet the net zero. We need to do something now, and SAF is the first and quick option in order to achieve this net zero reduction. Operation and infrastructure also contribute a small amount in 2050, but it should be noted that this 3% contribution is over and above improvements that the industry is continually developing, that accounts around 1.5–2% of efficiency per year. Example of operational improvements, and Gonzalo was mentioning before, is for improvement in the management of the airspace, retrofitting aircraft, better aerodynamics, reducing the weight of the aircraft, and maximizing operational efficiencies of the engines. Air traffic management is going to play a crucial role in order to bring those improvements and efficiencies. Airports and NSPs can maximize the contribution to sustainable and recovery goals by driving increased operational efficiency, ensuring reasonable infrastructure costs. All initiatives have the potential to bring efficiency and sustainability, but we need to ensure that both things fit together and we can do both. It's important to highlight that the most effective initiatives, actually from our point of view, is that those linked to reduce aircraft emissions. If you put into perspective and considering the worldwide passenger and cargo flights, basically all the reduction that you're able to achieve through different initiatives at airports will account between 2 to 3% of all the global emissions that the industry is producing. So that's why we encourage to put focus on those initiatives that are mainly helping to reduce these aircraft emissions. To give you an example, last week we were participating in one of the meetings with Zero Control, and one of the carriers mentioned that between all the different initiatives that they have put in place, flight altitude, control of waste, in order to improve the sustainability of the flight, just implementing continuous descent operation in the hub, were able to achieve all the savings that they were trying to achieve in the whole network. So that's why we need to be very careful about to pay special attention to those initiatives that are going to bring better benefits quicker. And last but not least, what is the plan to reach net zero? It cannot be, and it was mentioned several times by my colleagues before, it cannot be achieved by airlines alone. We can say what is the direction that we are going to take. We can make commitments, but we need all partners in the industry, all the shareholders, stakeholders, and also all governments to play their part. We have seen the potential of radical new technologies. Manufacturers are researching for electric, hybrid options, but this work needs to be accelerated. NSPs need to be more efficient. We need to have more free route, more direct routes, in order to ensure that the routes that airlines are using are as efficient as possible. And in terms of SAF, the big oil producers need to come to the party in a big way. We have seen latest movement from the big players, but now they need to deliver. We need them also to start delivering the commitment and start producing this SAF at a huge quantity in order to be able to have this reduction. And that's all from my side. Just to mention, just to late comments. Flying is not the problem, carbon it is. SAF will be the key in order to achieve this net zero by 2050. And third, we need the support for all the value chains, NSPs, airports, oil producers, investors, as well as governments, to have policies that foster research and development, and also that foster this ramp up of SAF production. That's Brian, everything from my side. So I think I have recovered the time that
you have, Sergio. That was great, and a great overview of what lies ahead and what we're all committed to achieving. And I think the big theme that's come through is the need for partnerships. And I suppose it's partnerships underpin the Sustainable Development Goals. So, that was great. If I could just quickly ask you one question, where do you think airports could play a more significant role when we're on the journey to net zero?
I think that any initiatives linked to airport that is going to improve, is going to reduce taxi times, is going to help this continuous descent operations, is going to reduce holdings on top of the airport, are going to be the ones that are going to support bigger reductions in a shorter time frame.
Thank you, Sergio. That's great. That's excellent. And we'll now move on to our fifth and final speaker. I'm sure the other panelists won't mind when I say we've saved the best to last, and with somebody a bit closer to home. No pressure, Holly. So we've got Holly Greig. Holly was appointed Deputy Director for Aviation Decarbonisation at the Department for Transport in 2020. She joined the department in January 15 as Head of Climate Change Strategy and worked on the department's overall response to reducing emissions from transport. Holly was then appointed Head of Office for the Minister for Aviation in August 2016, before being appointed Deputy Principal Private Secretary to the Transport Secretary in February 2018. Welcome, Holly. I know you're just fresh from COP. It's great to have you with us.
Thanks, Brian, and it's great to be here. So I've got a little presentation for you, and thank you for the introduction. So I'll do a little bit talking a bit about what me and my team are up to. If you can pop up the first slide for me, that would be fantastic. Fantastic. So yeah, myself and my team are responsible for aviation decarbonisation in the UK Department for Transport. And this slide just covers the kind of key areas that we work on every single day, frankly. So my team and I lead all the work we do in respect of international negotiations in ICAO on aviation decarbonisation and environment. We lead the work in respect of carbon pricing and markets in the UK. So that would be things like CORSIA and implementation of the UK ETS. We also lead on strategy and policies. So our Jet Zero strategy, our Jet Zero Council, and work in relation to SAF, although I'll speak very briefly about that again momentarily. And then finally, we work very closely with our teams in BAYS on accelerating emissions reduction through technology. So largely through aerospace, but also thinking about system efficiencies in airports and in our airspace and so on. So that's a bit of an overview of my team. You'll notice here that I don't specifically talk in great detail about sustainable aviation fuels. That's absolutely not because they're not hugely important to the UK government. It's just that we have a dedicated and separate team who lead all of our work on sustainable aviation fuels, partly because they are so important, but also because it's an incredibly complex area. So that's just a little bit of an overview of me and my team. And I suppose it's worth saying, as Brian said, we're kind of fresh out of COP26 Transport Day yesterday. So actually what I'm going to be doing is focusing my presentation today on what we did at COP26 in respect of aviation. But if we can go on to the next slide, please, I'll mention just a couple of other big things that my team and I have been working on this year. So hopefully people here have had the opportunity to read our Jet Zero Consultation, which came out in July. So that is kind of, I suppose, the UK government's proposals on how we will achieve net zero 2050 for the aviation sector. So the consultation, as I said, was out in July. It closed in September. We are considering the responses now, and we'll publish the final strategy early next year. I suppose in the context of this particular session, the main proposal I think I would draw out, there are a number of proposals in the consultation, as you would expect. But the main proposal that I think I would pull out from that is in respect of airports. So we are consulting on a 2040 zero emission target for airport operations in England. I suspect many people listening to this presentation have responded with their views on that. So we are just considering that at the moment. And as I said, we'll publish the final strategy next year. But if you haven't had an opportunity to read it and you're keen to understand the UK government's position in respect of aviation and net zero, then hopefully you'll find that a useful and interesting summary. The other initiative I just mentioned is our Jet Zero Council. Again, hopefully this is something you've heard of, but if not, you can have a look on Google and just type in Jet Zero Council and you should be able to get all the information you need. So that is the sort of UK government's key platform for engaging with industry in respect of our net zero aviation goals. So the council is chaired by Grant Shapps, who's our Transport Secretary, Kwasi Kwarteng, who is our Business Secretary, and then Emma Gilthorpe, who is the Chief Operating Officer of Heathrow, but is also the CEO of our Jet Zero Council. And that is a council that meets every 3 months. It has a number of different sort of sub-council groups that work specifically on zero emission flight and sustainable aviation fuels as two of our kind of key areas that we want to progress in terms of aviation decarbonisation. And as I said, it's our key platform for working between government and industry, given, as I think many panel members have already said, we recognise that collaboration is going to be key when it comes to decarbonising aviation. It's not something government can do on its own, but nor is it something industry can do on their own. So it's a good opportunity for us to kind of get together, discuss the key issues and drive progress forward. And then the other issue, or the other matter that I would flag here is COP26, so the UN conference that is ongoing as we speak. Yesterday was Transport Day, and we held a number of events specifically in relation to aviation. And funnily enough, that's what I'm going to focus on today, partly because it's fresh in my mind, but hopefully because it should be interesting to those listening. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. Great. So I hope, or I suspect, that most people here do know what COP26 is all about, but I'll just give a very brief kind of overview just in case you don't. So it kicked off on Sunday, the 31st of October, and it ends tomorrow. COP26, as it's sort of referred to, is the 26th conference of the parties, and those parties are those who signed up to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992. So this is the 26th time those parties have met to discuss climate change. Those of you who are sort of very up on UNFCCC might be aware of the fact that ICAO is actually the body who has responsibility for international aviation emissions, and that's where agreements are reached on how we will address those emissions. But that doesn't mean that COP26 isn't a key milestone on the road to ICAO and indeed our road to decarbonise the aviation sector. So it's been a perfect opportunity for us to build ambition and gather momentum in advance of the 2022 ICAO Assembly, which is due to take place in autumn next year. So what we've really been trying to do is do a bit of a showcase on all the exciting developments that are going on in aviation decarbonisation, but also, as I said, build momentum for policy initiatives that we know are going to be important. So next slide, please. So from a UK perspective, I suppose our main aim when it came to aviation at COP26 was to, as it says on the tin here, galvanise industry, state and civil society support for international action to reduce the impacts of aviation. We had 2 policy initiatives, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail momentarily. The first is our International Aviation Climate Ambition Coalition, and the second is our Clean Skies for Tomorrow SAF ambassadors. We also did quite a bit of work on ensuring that sustainable aviation fuels were supplied for those travelling by air to and from the conference. And we also made sure that we had a bit of a technology and industry showcase. In the green zone, we had Rolls-Royce showing their Spirit of Innovation aircraft. And we also held a Delivering Jet Zero panel with our CEO for the Jet Zero Council, Emma Gilthorpe, and a number of industry members, where we talked a lot about kind of the interactions between industry and government and how we can work collaboratively and together. But in respect of this presentation, I'll focus specifically on our 2 policy initiatives. So if we can have the next slide, please. Fantastic. So our headline policy initiative, which hopefully you may have seen a little bit about yesterday, was our International Aviation Climate Ambition Coalition. And what this is really intending to do is bring together an ambitious group of states who want to see increased action in respect of aviation decarbonisation ahead of the ICAO Assembly in 2022. And the UK's main aim for that assembly is to agree a long-term goal for international aviation emissions that is consistent with the 1.5 degree C. So what we've been doing over the past year is working to build a broad, diverse, and I should say continuously growing, sort of every hour I'm checking my phone for more people who want to join the coalition. At the moment, we're at 23. Those states are there on the slide. And they, as I said, are a coalition of states who want to see increased ambition in aviation. It will specifically show support for the declaration which we published yesterday, specifically shows support for ICAO adopting, as I say, a 1.5 degree consistent long-term goal. But it also includes a range of other initiatives in terms of ensuring the maximum effectiveness of CORSIA, development and deployment of sustainable aviation fuels, and development and deployment of low and zero emission technologies. So you can actually go online now. I've put the link on the slide. You can read the declaration in its entirety. It will tell you again who the states are, but the latest list is on this slide. And you can find out a bit more information there. But essentially, that is our sort of headline initiative. And what we really want to be doing is bringing together those states who are like-minded, as I say, and want to see increased ambition in ICAO in terms of aviation decarbonisation. And what we hope to do is continue to work with those states over the next year to really, as I said, drive and build momentum towards ICAO in 2022. Next slide, please. And then our second policy initiative, which we launched yesterday at Transport Day, is our group of SAF ambassadors and the SAF toolkit. So the cover of it is there. You can scan and have a look at the toolkit in its entirety. It's available on the World Economic Forum website. So over the course of this year, we've been working with the World Economic Forum to convene a small group of SAF ambassador states. They're listed here. So it's the UK, Costa Rica, UAE, Netherlands, Kenya, and Singapore. And those states have been working really closely with the World Economic Forum to develop what we've called a SAF policy toolkit. So we launched that yesterday. And what the toolkit does is it contains a huge range of practical and innovative SAF policy proposals that can be implemented by states in all regions. So some of the speakers earlier on today have talked about some of the challenges of bringing forward SAF, largely in relation to kind of it being far more expensive than traditional kerosene. Also, the fact that we need to bring forward investments so we can build plants and sort of a range of other issues. So what the toolkit seeks to do is it can be a bit of a toolkit and a guide for those states who want to take forward SAF policies, but perhaps aren't entirely sure where to start. So it's intended to be a sort of something you can look at, and you can, as a state, pick those interventions that you think are most appropriate for you, and it gives you a bit of a starting point as to how you can implement those policies. So that's the first thing that the SAF ambassadors have done, but this isn't going to be the end of their work. So we'll continue to work with this group of states in relation to SAF policies. And we very much hope that these states will be kind of some of those leading states who start to implement those policies as well. And hopefully people here will have seen that the UK recently consulted on our SAF mandate, considering up to 10% SAF by 2030. And again, in the new year, we'll be publishing our final proposals in relation to a SAF mandate. But that isn't the only policy that's contained in this toolkit. It considers a range of policies that an ambitious state may want to consider when it comes to implementing sustainable aviation fuels. Next slide, please. So very briefly, then I'm conscious of time, what next? So we'll be holding our next Jet Zero Council meeting before the end of 2021. As I say, you can have a look on the Jet Zero Council website and see a bit more information. We've got information there about our subgroups. We publish the minutes. So if you want to see what the council's up to and what we're focusing on, you can find all of that information available there. Then we'll be working with so as it stands, our 23 states who are members of our International Aviation Climate Ambition Coalition, as I say, to build momentum and ambition towards the 41st ICAO Assembly in 2022, where we hope to agree an ambitious long-term goal for international aviation. We are then going to be publishing the final Jet Zero strategy early next year, where we'll be setting out how aviation can achieve net zero by 2050. And then we'll be continuing to work with the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Ambassadors, as I say, to develop, well, I suppose, more innovative products that we can help other states to implement SAF policies, but hopefully where we can encourage those members of the sort of ambassador group to implement some of their own SAF policies as well. So that was a bit of a quick run through, but as I say, I've focused on COP26 because it was hot off the press, but hopefully there's sort of a bit more information if you want to dive into all the other things that the UK government is up to in respect of aviation decarbonisation. And the other thing I would say is that if you haven't had a chance to have a look, you can actually watch the launch events of the Coalition and the SAF ambassadors back on YouTube. They're available now if you want to watch what ministers have to say and get a bit more information about that. So that's it from me, Brian. I think that's probably about time as well.
Yeah, no, that's great, Holly. And it was obviously a really busy day yesterday in the COP. And I think what shines through is you mentioned it yourself, the momentum. The momentum seems to be behind the industry. And I think we forget, what we've all been through over the past 20 months. So for the industry to come together in the way it has is, I think, quite remarkable. So can I just ask, you're waiting for some more text to come through, some more countries to join. How challenging was it to get so many countries to sign up to the Climate Ambition Coalition?
Reasonably challenging, I would say. So, I mean, as is always the way with international negotiations, I think I heard someone actually say this week, which I thought was really interesting, and he was talking about 196 states, and if you had to get 196 of your friends and agree where you were going to go for dinner, that would be pretty complex. So getting everyone to agree some incredibly complicated text is even more challenging. Although obviously it's fair to say we don't have 196 states yet for our coalition, but watch this space. But I think that's the most challenging thing, and it's finding the right balance between wanting to do something that is genuinely ambitious, but trying to bring as many people with you as possible. And it's finding that balance. I would say that, striking the perfect balance is never easy.
No, well, it's been a huge achievement and well done. It's just a fantastic start and much to look forward to. Look, thanks for that, Holly. We are almost out of time. I do want to ask just one quick question. I'll maybe put it to our other panelists as well. But I suppose, how optimistic are you that we can achieve our net zero target by 2050?
I'm an eternal optimist. And the other thing I guess I would say is we have to. I mean, it's there isn't really a choice here. So I certainly believe, there's some of the best minds on this. I genuinely believe we can. Sessions like today just show how much expertise and passion there is out there. So I'm absolutely optimistic, and as I say, we have to. So that would be my view.
Great. No, maybe Michael, the same to yourself. Same question.
I share Holly's optimism in some parts. I'm very optimistic that we as the aviation community can do it. But looking very much at Holly, is that we do need the support of governments to be able to do so. We've drawn out some of the challenges that we are facing, in particular with respect to infrastructure. And particularly if we're looking at increasing electricity supply to airports, if we're looking at bringing hydrogen to airports, these are huge infrastructure ambitions. And I think that we can work together, and I think that some of the initiatives that the DFT has brought forward are really very helpful in that regard. And I would definitely say that, we as ACI are ready to work with DFT, to work with other governments, and of course, as we already do, to work with other parts of industry. I'd just like to very quickly pick up on a comment from Sergio with respect to airport infrastructure. I alluded to that in my presentation. We're not a value chain, we're actually an ecosystem. And that means that we have all got to work together collaboratively to achieve these objectives. And I think that we really do have a common objective here. And I think it was very, very well articulated by Holly as to we have got no choice. And provided we continue to work together, we will get there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I think you're right. It's not just because it is the right thing to do. We have to do it, and I think there has really been that collegiate approach over the past number of months. Scott, can I ask you the same question? In optimism, how optimistic are you? We can 2050.
This is where our entire group lives. This is what we aspire to support and help, and we work on the analysis side. So we see the technologies exist. We see the interest out of industry, both from manufacturers, and we're seeing growing interest out of the U.S. federal agencies specifically. But this is moving forward, and there's a strong ambition to make this happen. So we don't make policy, we do analysis, and we want to make sure that's clear. So it's up to you all to do that. We just try and give good data and try and support and make sure the technology is ready to go. So.
Great, thanks, Scott. And Sergio, finally, yourself, how optimistic are you?
I'm fully optimistic. So it's going to be extremely challenging. It's going to be difficult, but it's going to be achievable. And the plan is there, the tools are there, the commitment from the stakeholders are there, the technology is there, the brilliant minds are there. So basically, just we are putting everything together, and with the clever people and with the willingness of achieving it, it's going to happen for sure.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sergio. I'm glad you ended on a positive and optimistic note, but I think you're right. The plan's there, the tools there, technology is almost there in some cases. With SAF, it's here. So I do think we're in a good place. And as an AGS, an airport operator, we did announce yesterday plans for solar technology. We've set our own target for mid-2030s of net zero, and like everyone, we're just going to have to get on with it. So thank you, and that brings us to the end of the third and final session of Carbon is Key. It's been a fantastic 3 days, and I'd like to thank all of our participants. I'd like to thank Michael, Rossell, Gonzalo, Velasco, Scott, Cary, Sergio Fernandez, and Holly Greig. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you, all the delegates, for joining this. It's been excellent, and let's look forward with some positivity, and we'll all make great strides in our journey to net zero. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks, Bye, everyone.